Have you ever wondered about the concept of nothingness? It's a paradox that has puzzled philosophers, scientists, and thinkers for centuries. But what exactly is nothingness? Is it even possible for nothing to exist? At first glance, nothingness seems simple. It's the absence of anything, the void. But when you delve deeper, it becomes far more complex. In the world of physics, even a vacuum isn't truly empty. It's filled with quantum fluctuations, particles popping in and out of existence. So can we really say nothing exists? The ancient Greek philosopher Parmenides argued that nothing is an impossible concept. According to him, if you can think about nothing, then it must be something. In mathematics, zero is often considered the representation of nothingness. However, zero is a number, a symbol that holds a place in our numeric system. It's a concept used to denote the absence of quantity, but it's still something. Even in everyday language, we use nothing to describe situations, feelings, and states of being. There's nothing in the fridge, or I have nothing to do. These sentences are full of meaning and context, showing that nothingness is always something more. Why is there something rather than nothing? Well, why not? Why expect nothing rather than something? No experiment could support the hypothesis. There is nothing, because any observation obviously implies the existence of an observer. Is there any a priori support for there is nothing? One might respond with a methodological principle that propels the empty world to the top of the agenda. For instance, many feel that whoever asserts the existence of something has the burden of proof. If an astronomer says there is water at the south pole of the moon, then it is up to him to provide data in support of the lunar water. If we were not required to have evidence to back our existential claims, then a theorist who fully explained the phenomena with one set of things could gratuitously add an extra entity, say a pebble outside our light cone. We recoil from such add-ons. To prevent the intrusion of superfluous entities, one might demand that metaphysicians start with the empty world and admit only those entities that have credentials. This is the entry requirement imposed by René Descartes. He clears everything out and then only lets back in what can be proved to exist. Augustine had more conservative counsel. We should not start at the beginning nor at the end, but where we are in the middle. We reach a verdict about the existence of controversial things by assessing how well these entities would harmonize with the existence of better established things. If we start from nothing, we lack the bearings needed to navigate forward. Conservatives, coherentists, and scientific gradualists all cast a suspicious eye on why is there something rather than nothing. The first part of this justification is plausible. Nothing exists is simple in the sense of being an easy-to-remember generalization. Consider a test whose questions have the form "does X exist?" The rule "always answer no" is unsurpassably short and comprehensive. There is no such thing as nothingness, and zero does not exist. Everything is something. Nothing is nothing. Neither rule makes for serious metaphysics. Even if nothing exists were the uniquely simplest possibility, as measured by memorability, why should we expect that possibility to be actual? If there is only one empty world and many populated worlds, then a random selection would lead us to expect a populated world. Is this statistical explanation scientific? Why do I have enough oxygen to breathe, even though all the oxygen molecules could have congregated in one corner of my room? Is there at most one empty world? Most philosophers would grant Peter Van's premise that there is no more than one empty world. They have been trained to model the empty world on the empty set. There can be no more than one empty set because distinct sets require a difference in their members. However, medieval philosophers differentiated empty worlds by the power of places within those worlds. Most thinkers retained Aristotle's assumption that there was a unique center of the universe. Aristotle used this point to provide a spectacular explanation of why there are not two Earths. They would have collided. Since air, fire, earth, and water each had their own places in Aristotle's physics, 14th century philosophers could imagine worlds that differed as to which of these places to retain. The void was rarely pictured as homogeneous. Aristotle's world is self-governed. Objects have powers that collectively explain the order of the universe. Thinkers in the Abrahamic tradition replaced Aristotle's invisible hand explanation with God's hidden hand. God dictated laws of nature to which he made periodic adjustments, like clockmakers who regularly serviced their creations, correcting the accumulating errors. Focus on God's perfection made attributions of divine intervention. Isaac Newton's first law of motion says an undisturbed object will continue in motion in a straight line. Some previous physicists suggested that such an object will slow down and tend to travel in a circle. This empty world differs from the Newtonian empty world because different counterfactual statements are true of it. If variation in empty worlds can be sustained by differences in the laws that apply to them, there will be infinitely many empty worlds. The gravitational constant of an empty world can equal any real number between 0 and 1, so there are more than countably many empty worlds. Indeed, any order of infinity achieved by the set of populated possible worlds will be matched by the set of empty worlds. As Immanuel Kant emphasized in his explanation of why science cannot establish necessary truths, we do not literally see actual states of affairs as being contingent rather than necessary. Contingency, unlike color or shape, is not perceptible, nor is there any presumption for regarding states of affairs as contingent. Subjective chance does not suffice for objective chance. To demonstrate the impossibility of long-term prediction, Daniel Kahneman, Oliver Siboney, and Cass Sunstein invite the reader to consider the fact that at the instant of conception, there was an even chance that every significant figure in history, and also the insignificant ones, would be born with a different gender. Those who believe in the necessity of origins will disagree. According to Saul Kripke, Socrates could not have originated from a sperm-egg combination other than the one from which he actually originated. Since the Y chromosome of his father dictated Socrates' biological gender, Socrates is as essentially male as he is essentially human. When we imagine Sophroniscus siring a daughter with Phanerete in 469 BC, we are imagining Socrates failing to exist. Kripke's Metaphysics also precludes the consolation Richard Dawkins offers in Unweaving the Rainbow. We are going to die, and that makes us the lucky ones. Most people are never going to die because they are never going to be born. The potential people who could have been here in my place outnumber the sand grains of Arabia. From Kripke's perspective, the number of non-existent people is 0 when we speak of those who are never conceived. We are imagining a possible world with a population originating from alternative sperm-egg combinations. They would have existed but do not exist. Notoriously, the modal realist David Lewis contends that people in other possible worlds exist just as much as actual people. These people have no more reason to envy us than we have for envying them. Relative to the world of these potential people, we are the non-actual people. Actual is an indexical term on a par with here and now. When you imagine yourself not existing, you are thinking about a possible world that resembles the actual world, except there is no counterpart of you. Your existence in the actual world is not a matter of luck. According to Heil, why is there something rather than nothing? Owes its urgency to a partisan background theory, not a neutral arbiter such as perception or methodology. Why is there something rather than nothing is not about the origin of the world. Can there be an explanatory framework for the question? Some disagree with Peter van Inwagen's assumption that each possible world is as likely as any other. There have been metaphysical systems that favor less populated worlds. Indeed, the original purveyor of possible worlds, Gottfried Leibniz, pictured possible things as angling to become actual. The more a thing competes with other things, the more likely that there will be something that stops it from becoming real. The winners in Leibniz's struggle for existence are cooperative. They uniquely fit the niche formed by other things. This keyhole into existence implicitly conveys information about everything. The little bit that is not tells us about all that there is. On the one hand, this metaphysical bias in favor of simplicity is heartening because it suggests that the actual world is not too complex for human understanding. Scientists have penetrated deeply into the physical world with principles that emphasize parsimony and uniformity. Occam's razor, the least effort principle, the anthropic principle, etc. On the other hand, Leibniz worried that the metaphysical bias for simplicity, when driven to its logical conclusion, yields the embarrassing prediction that there is nothing. After all, an empty world would be free of objects trying to elbow each other out. It is the world that requires the least effort to produce and sustain. So why is there something rather than nothing? Even if there were previously something, why is there still something? Why is so much still going on? To avoid an answer that assigns us a special position in history, we would have to model the universe as a perpetual motion machine. When worried by the bias in favor of simplicity, Leibniz pictures each nominee for existence as in a limbo between being and non-being. The least complicated election is for none of the nominees to win a post. Any other election is arbitrary, but this election is superfluous if there are no degrees of being. Given that existence is discrete, there is no boundary between non-existent things and existent things. Leibniz's limbo illustrates an explanatory trap. To explain why something exists, we standardly appeal to the existence of something else. This pattern of explanation is not possible for why is there something rather than nothing. For instance, if we answer there is something because the universal designer wanted there to be something, then our explanation takes for granted the existence of the universal designer. Someone who poses the question in a comprehensive way will not grant the existence of the universal designer as a starting point. If the explanation cannot begin with some entity, then it is hard to see how any explanation is feasible. Some philosophers conclude why is there something rather than nothing is unanswerable. They think the question stumps us by imposing an impossible explanatory demand, namely, deduce the existence of something without using any existential premises. In the 20th century, Russell's set paradox raised another challenge. If there is a set for every property, there should be a set that contains only those sets that do not contain themselves as a member. But the existence of such a set would imply a contradiction. So set theory needed to preclude this universal set. This raises concern about other totalities. The universe is, well, universal. All questions about existence must be relativized to sorts. Consequently, the question of why there is something rather than nothing is incomplete. Once we remedy the incompleteness with a sortal, the question will be answered by science. Empiricists such as Hume deny that the existence of anything could be proved by reason alone. Rationalists have been more optimistic. Many have offered a priori proofs of God's existence. Such a proof would double as an explanation of why there is something. If God exists, then something exists. After all, God is something. But would God be the right sort of something? Now, let's delve into another layer of this profound question by examining the restriction to concrete entities. Philosopher Peter Van offers an intriguing perspective. Our query about existence is fundamentally concerned with concrete things. A grain of sand, a camel, and an oasis each represent concrete entities, parts of the causal order. In contrast, abstract entities like numbers, sets, and possible worlds do not cause anything directly. Those who adopt the principle that only causes are real become nominalists, asserting that everything is concrete. Concrete entities are characterized by their locatability. They have positions in space or time. These entities are situated and possess boundaries with their environment. The only exception might be an entity that occupies all space or all time, such as the perfect animal described in Plato's Timaeus. While points in space and time have locations, concrete entities are only accidentally where and when they are, possessing intrinsic properties that make their boundaries natural rather than conventional. Max Black imagines twin iron spheres in an otherwise empty universe. The spheres are distinct, yet share the same relationships and intrinsic properties. All material things are concrete, but some concrete things might be immaterial. Shadows and holes, for instance, have locations and durations, but are not made of anything material. There is extraneous light in shadows and extraneous matter in holes, but these are contaminants rather than constituents. Once we acknowledge the existence of cracks, we get an unexpected, transcendental explanation of why there is something. If there is nothing, then there is an absence of anything. Therefore, there exists something, either a positive concrete entity or an absence. Ontological pluralists do not dismiss this proof as sophistry. Chris McDaniel, for example, thinks the proof is trivially correct. To address a more interesting question, McDaniel follows Aristotle's principle that there are many ways of being. From the pluralist's perspective, debate over whether wholes exist is equivocal. Friends of absences use a broad sense of being, while enemies of wholes speak from a higher link in the chain of being. From this altitude, wholes depend on their hosts, and so cannot be as real. Alexius Meinong's talk of subsistence alludes to the lowest level of being. Why does anything subsist? Is a perfectly legitimate question, according to McDaniel. If there are souls or Cartesian minds, they will also qualify as immaterial concrete entities. Although they do not take up space, they take up time. An idealist such as George Berkeley could ask, why is there something rather than nothing, even though he was convinced that material things are not possible. William James, however, denied that his defense of parapsychology provided a resource for answering. How comes the world to be here at all, instead of the non-entity which might be imagined in its place? Philosophy, be it natural or supernatural, can make no progress on this issue, for from nothing to being there is no logical bridge, James concludes. The question of being is the darkest in all philosophy. All of us are beggars here, and no school can speak disdainfully of another or give itself superior airs. There's no tradition of wondering, why is there space and time? Because space and time are seen as frameworks for contingent things. Absolutists view this framework as existing independently of what it frames, while others, like Leibniz and Einstein, see space as an abstraction from relations between objects, thus, answers to riddles about space reduced to questions about objects. Imagine for a moment that the matter which now constitutes our solar system had formed as usual into two stars instead of one. In such a scenario, Earth would not have existed. This brings us to a critical point. If no concrete thing is a necessary being, then no concrete thing can explain the existence of concrete things. Even if God is not a concrete entity, proof of his existence would raise the hope of explaining the existence of concrete things. For instance, the Genesis creation story suggests that God made everything without relying on any antecedent ingredients and that he had a reason to create. If this account could be corroborated, we would have an explanation for why there are some concrete things. However, this divine explanation threatens to over-explain the data. Given that God is a necessary being and that his existence necessitates the existence of Earth, then Earth would be a necessary being rather than a contingent one. This dilemma was generalized by philosopher William Rowe in 1975. Consider all the contingent truths. The conjunction of all these truths is itself a contingent truth. On the one hand, this conjunction cannot be explained by any contingent truth because the conjunction already contains all contingent truths. The explanation would be circular. On the other hand, this conjunction cannot be explained by a necessary truth because a necessary truth can only imply other necessary truths. Rowe's dilemma suggests that the question, why are there any contingent beings, is impossible to answer. Rowe presupposes that an answer would have to be a deductive explanation. However, if there are inferences to the best explanation, or inductive explanations, then there might be a way through the horns of Rowe's dilemma. There is also hope that Rowe's dilemma can be bypassed by showing that the empty world is not a genuine possibility. The retort to why is there something rather than nothing could then be there is no alternative to there being something. There might be nothing is false when read epistemically. We know that something actually exists, and knowledge of actuality precludes all rival epistemic possibilities. But when read metaphysically, there might be nothing seems true. Henri Bergson maintained that the positive nature of reality preempts nothingness. For instance, the absence of green mammals is not a brute fact. There are no green mammals is made true by a positive fact. All mammals are hairy, and there are only two pigments for hair, one producing black or brown hair, the other yellow or reddish-orange. No mixture of those pigments yields green. Once we have the positive facts and the notion of negation, we can derive all the negative facts. There is nothing would be a contingent negative fact, but then it would have to be grounded on some positive reality. That positive reality would ensure that there is something rather than nothing. Human beings have a strong intuition that positive truths, such as elephants are huge, are more fundamental than negative truths, such as elephants do not jump. The robustness of this tendency makes negative things objects of amusement. Consider the professor's remark during his chilly banquet in Lewis Carroll's Sylvie and Bruno concluded, "I hope you'll enjoy the dinner, such as it is, and that you won't mind the heat, such as it isn't." The sentence sounded well, but somehow I couldn't quite understand it. How can we perceive absences? They seem causally inert, and so not the sort of thing that we could check empirically. Negative truths seem redundant. There are no more truths than those entailed by the conjunction of all positive truths. The negative truths seem psychological. We only assert negative truths to express a frustrated expectation. When Jean-Paul Sartre arrives late for his appointment with Pierre at the cafe, he sees the absence of Pierre, but not the absence of the Duke of Wellington. Philosophers have had much trouble vindicating any of these intuitions. they still try to preserve as much of the positivity as they can. For instance, Stephen Mumford characterizes himself as a soft Parmenidean. His 21st century willingness to tolerate some negativity is informed by Bertrand Russell's 20th century failure to reduce negative truths to positive truths. Russell tried paraphrasing, "The cat is not on the mat," as there is a state of affairs incompatible with the cat being on the mat. But this paraphrase is covertly negative. It uses incompatible, which means not compatible. He tried modeling not P as an expression of disbelief that P, but disbelief means believing that something is not the case. Is it even clear that absences are causally inert? Trap miners are killed by the absence of oxygen. In the end, Russell surrendered his intuition that reality is positive. In a famous lecture at Harvard, Russell concluded that irreducibly negative facts exist. He reports this nearly caused a riot. Were it not for the threat to social order, one might stand the intuition on its head. Negative truths are more fundamental than positive truths. From a logical point of view, there is greater promise in a reduction of positive truths to negative truths. Positive truths can be analyzed as the negations of negative truths, or perhaps as frustrated disbelief. Positive truths would then be the redundant hangers-on kept in circulation by our well-documented difficulty in coping with negative information. Think of photographic negatives. They seem less informative than positive prints. But since the prints are manufactured from the negatives must be merely more difficult for us to process. But we could let computers do our metaphysics just as we let them do our taxes. We engage in negative thinking to avoid highly complicated positive thinking. Our predilection for positive thinking could reflect an objective feature of our world instead of being a mere anthropocentric projection of one style of thought. But if this objective positiveness is itself contingent, then it does not explain why there is something rather than nothing. Next is the thought experiment proposed by Thomas Baldwin in 1996, which explores the possibility of an empty world. Imagine a world in which there are only finitely many objects. Now, suppose each object vanishes in sequence. Eventually, you run down to 3 objects, 2 objects, 1 object, and then poof, there's your empty world. What can be done temporally can be done modally. There is only a small difference between a possible world with 100 objects and a possible world with just 99, and from there to, well, just do the arithmetic. But can the subtraction be completed if there necessarily are infinitely many things? Penelope Maddy, 1990, claims that unit sets are concrete entities, sharing the location of their members. The existence of one concrete entity would guarantee the existence of infinitely many, making finite worlds impossible. Baldwin sidesteps this issue by redefining concrete entities as violators of Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles. Concrete things may have exact duplicates, unlike unit sets, which Baldwin counts as abstract entities. However, Geraldine Coggins, 2010, objects to Baldwin's definition, arguing that the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic properties is too problematic to ground the difference between concrete and abstract objects. She also points out that infinite proliferation can result from the constitution relation. If concrete entities are infinitely divisible, an infinitely complex object cannot be nibbled away with any number of finite bytes. Gonzalo Rodriguez Pereira, 2013, suggests taking big infinite bytes instead of subtracting entity by entity. Our metaphysical calculations are influenced by how we picture possible worlds. If we see them as containers, they can be completely emptied. If we envision them as stories, our library will contain a tale lacking any concrete entities. But if possible worlds are mereological as giant conglomerates of concrete objects, subtraction falters before we reach zero. Some kind of background theory of possible worlds is needed. Without this guidance, the subtraction argument seems invalid. From a neutral perspective, it is possible for each object to not exist, but it may be necessary that at least one object exists. Aristotle, the founder of modal logic, believed that all abstract entities depend on concrete entities for their existence, and that there are necessary truths. The existence of any particular individual is contingent, but it is necessary that some individuals exist. Science textbooks teem with contingent abstract entities, and 20th century mathematics made sets central. Sets are defined by their members, so any set containing a contingent entity is itself contingent. Mathematicians can reconstruct all of mathematics from sets, assuming something exists. But founding all of mathematics on a contingent being like Cameron Winklevoss fails to reflect the necessary status of mathematical truth. Founding it on a necessary being like God would alienate atheists. So mathematicians spin this amazing structure from the empty set. This does not avoid all controversy. A world without objects would be a world without facts, and a factless world is a contradiction in terms. As we continue our philosophical journey, we venture into the realm of ontological neutrality and its implications in logic. Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, assumed that universal generalizations inherently carried existential import. For instance, when he said, "all gods are immortal," he implied the existence of gods. Contemporary logicians, while agreeing that universal quantifiers have existential import, analyze these generalizations as conditionals. They interpret "all gods are immortal" as, for each thing, if it is a god, then it is immortal. This conditional approach allows atheists to argue consistently. All gods are immortal, immortality is impossible, therefore there are no gods. Modern logicians are also intrigued by the intuitive equivalence between statements like "all men are mortal" and their contrapositives, such as "all immortals are non-men." This equivalence is predicted by the hypothesis that universal generalizations are conditionals. However, the tolerance of vacuously true generalizations does not mean contemporary classical logic supports the concept of an empty world. Since its universal quantifier implies the existence of something, each of its logical laws necessitates some form of existence. For example, the principle of identity, everything is identical to itself, implies there exists something that is identical to itself. Logicians striving for ontological neutrality avoid engaging in metaphysical disputes. They aim to rectify what Bertrand Russell deemed a defect in logical purity, leading some philosophers to challenge the existential import of classical quantifiers. Proponents of free logic aim to eliminate the existential presupposition of singular terms. Unlike classical logic, which requires names to have bearers, free logic accommodates empty names like Sherlock Holmes is a detective, and negative existentials, such as Pegasus does not exist. Free logicians argue that these changes are essential to avoid trivially implying existential propositions. However, Jan Halen contends that free logic still implies other existential sentences, concluding that any deductive answer to the question will inevitably be influenced by the background logic. Quine posited that we can derive our ontology from the existentially quantified statements in well-accepted theories. For example, if evolutionary theory claims that some species evolved from others, then biologists, and by extension metaphysicians, are committed to the existence of species. Quine addresses the challenge posed by the empty domain through compromise. He suggests that logical theorems should hold in all non-empty domains. In rare cases where the empty universe must be considered, universal quantifications would be counted as true, and existential quantifications as false. As we delve deeper into the logical landscape, we encounter a curious problem: the issue of multiple nothings. Many of the principles used to rule out total emptiness also preclude small pockets of emptiness. Leibniz, for instance, argued that the actual world must have something rather than nothing because it is the best of all possible worlds, and something is inherently better than nothing. By this reasoning, Leibniz also concluded that there are no vacuums in the actual world. More is better than less. He further targeted the possibility of there being more than one void. If there could be more than one void, then there could be two voids of exactly the same shape and size. These two voids would be perfect twins. Everything true of one void would be true of the other. This is precluded by the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. If everything true of X is true of Y, then X is identical to I. A second problem with multiple voids arises from efforts to paraphrase them away. Since the time of Melissus, there have been arguments against the possibility of a void existing in the same manner as an object. Melissus posited, "Nor is there any void, for void is nothing and nothing cannot be. If you claim there is a vacuum in the flask, you are affirming the existence of something in the flask, the vacuum. But since a vacuum means an absence of something, you are also denying that there is something in the flask. Therefore, there is a vacuum in the flask is a contradiction." Some philosophers respond to Melissus's argument by analyzing vacuums as properties of things rather than things in their own right. Can a materialist believe that there are holes in his Swiss cheese? The holes are where the matter is not. So to admit the existence of holes is to admit the existence of immaterial objects. One response is to paraphrase, "There is a hole in the cheese," as the cheese holes, or more naturally, the cheese is perforated. What appeared to be a wild existential claim is now a comment on the shape of the cheese. But how do we distinguish between the cheese having two holes as opposed to one? Some cheese is singly perforated, some doubly perforated, and others n-perforated, where n equals the number of holes in the cheese. We must be careful not to define imperforation in terms of holes. That would reintroduce the holes we set out to avoid. Can holes be evaded by focusing on the process of perforation? Single-hole punchers differ from triple-hole punchers by how they act, singly rather than triply. However, the difficulty with this process-oriented proposal is that the product, a hole, is needed to distinguish between successful and merely attempted perforation. Furthermore, the paraphrase does not extend to holes that arise from processes such as looping. If the universe popped into existence 5 minutes ago, most holes formed without any process. The struggle to sustain the concept of multiple voids may drive us to consider the most extreme answer to the age-old question, why is there something rather than nothing? This answer posits that not only must there be something, but there must be no emptiness whatsoever. Parmenides argued that it is inherently contradictory to assert that something does not exist. This linguistic conundrum is encapsulated in the problem of negative existentials. For example, the statement "Atlantis does not exist" paradoxically references Atlantis, implying that it must exist in some form to be the subject of discussion. This leads to the Parmenidean conclusion, no relation without relata, hence the statement "Atlantis does not exist" cannot be true, as it presupposes the existence of Atlantis to deny it. Opposing Parmenides, the atomists proposed that the world is composed of simple, indivisible entities moving through empty space. They endorsed the void to explain observable phenomena like movement, compression, and absorption. Zeno of Elea, a disciple of Parmenides, amassed arguments to demonstrate that motion is impossible, thereby rejecting the atomist reliance on empirical data. Less radical opponents of vacuums, such as Aristotle, sought to reinterpret these phenomena within a framework of plenism. Aristotle argued that although the universe is full, objects can move because other objects make way for them. He explained compression and absorption by suggesting that objects are pushed aside to accommodate others. In his work Timaeus, Plato attempted to reconcile atomism with plenism by proposing that atoms are Platonic solids, each playing a role in the composition of objects. Aristotle countered that Platonic solids cannot fill space without leaving gaps, which would necessitate tiny vacuums. He suggested that only cubic atoms could fill space completely, a claim accepted for centuries despite its refutability. Aristotle's objections to the void extended to the explanation of motion. He argued that movement requires a mover, and in a vacuum, an object would not be in contact with anything to facilitate this movement. Consequently, any motion in a vacuum would occur at an unlimited speed, conflicting with the principle that no object can be in two places simultaneously. This view dominated philosophical thought for 1500 years. However, dissenters like the Stoics and Hero of Alexandria challenged Aristotle's thesis. The Stoics believed in a cosmic void, while Hero argued that vacuums could be artificially created, citing devices like pumps and siphons. Hero's ideas gained traction after the Church's condemnation of Aristotelian views in 1277, which necessitated the acceptance of vacuums to preserve the notion of God's omnipotence. The Christian perspective on creation from nothing further complicated matters. Genesis 1:1 describes God creating the world from nothing. Creation out of nothing presupposes the possibility of total nothingness. This in turn implies that there can be some nothingness. Thus, Christians had a motive to first establish the possibility of a little nothingness. Their strategy was to start small and scale up. Accordingly, scholars writing in the aftermath of the condemnation of 1277 proposed various recipes for creating vacuums. Schmidt, 1967. One scheme was to freeze a sphere filled with water. After the water contracted into ice, a vacuum would form at the top. Aristotelians replied that the sphere would bend at its weakest point. When the vacuist stipulated that the sphere was perfect, the rejoinder was that this would simply prevent the water from turning into ice. Neither side appears to have tried out the recipe. If either had, then they would have discovered that freezing water expands rather than contracts. To contemporary thinkers, this dearth of empirical testing is bizarre. The puzzle is intensified by the fact that the medievals did empirically test many hypotheses, especially in optics. Hero was eventually refuted by experiments conducted by Evangelista Torricelli and Blaise Pascal. In effect, they created a barometer consisting of a tube, partially submerged upside down, in a bowl of mercury. What keeps the mercury suspended in the tube? Is there an unnatural vacuum that causes the surrounding glass to pull the liquid up? Or is there no vacuum at all, but rather some rarefied and invisible matter in the empty space? Pascal answered that there really was nothing holding up the mercury. The mercury rises and falls due to variations in the weight of the atmosphere. The mercury is being pushed up the tube, not pulled up by anything. When Pascal offered this explanation, Descartes wrote Christian Huygens, the 8th of December 1647, that the hasty young man had the vacuum too much on his mind. If there were nothing between two objects, then they would be touching each other. And if they are touching each other, there is no gap between them. Well, maybe the apparent gap is merely a thinly occupied region of space. On this distributional model, there is no intermediate empty object that separates the two objects. There is merely unevenly spread matter. This model is very good at eliminating vacuums in the sense of empty objects. However, it is also rather good at eliminating ordinary objects. What we call objects would just be relatively thick deposits of matter. There would be only one natural object, the whole universe. How could the great Kepler believe something so silly? After Isaac Newton resurrected Kepler's hypothesis, he eventually capitulated to orthodoxy and stuffed the space between the moon and the earth with ether. Indeed, the universality of Newton's law of gravitation seems to require that the whole universe be filled with a subtle substance. How else could the universe be bound together by causal chains? Hunger for ether intensified as the wave-like features of light became established. It is tautologous that a wave must have a medium, or is it? As the theoretical roles of the ether proliferated, physicists began to doubt there could be anything that accomplished such diverse feats. These doubts about the existence of ether were intensified by the emergence of Einstein's theory of relativity. He presented his theory as a relational account of space. If there were no objects, there would be no space. Space is merely a useful abstraction. Even those physicists who wished to retain substantival space broke with the atomist tradition of assigning virtually no properties to the void. They reassigned much of ether's responsibilities to space itself. Instead of having gravitational forces being propagated through the ether, they suggest that space is bent by mass. To explain how space can be finite and yet unbounded, they characterize space as spherical. When Edwin Hubble discovered that heavenly bodies are traveling away from each other, like ants resting on an expanding balloon, cosmologists were quick to suggest that space may be expanding. Expanding into what? Wondered bewildered laymen. How can space bend? How can space have a shape? Historians of science wonder whether the ether that was loudly pushed out the front door of physics is quietly returning through the back door under the guise of space. Quantum field theory provides especially fertile ground for such speculation. Particles are created with the help of energy present in vacuums. To say that vacuums have energy and energy is convertible into mass is to deny that vacuums are empty. Many physicists revel in the discovery that vacuums are far from empty. Frank Wilczek, Stephen Hawking, and Leonard Memlodinow, as well as Lawrence Krauss, explicitly claim that this answers the question of why there is something rather than nothing. The basic idea goes back to an issue raised by the symmetry of matter and antimatter. Given that the symmetry implies equality, matter and antimatter should have annihilated each other. Creation should have been aborted. Why is there now something, particles, rather than nothing, mere energy in a quantum field? This question was answered by calculations suggesting that there was about a billionth more matter than antimatter. Although it is still possible for the universe to be without particles, the slight numeric imbalance biases the universe toward states in which there are many particles. A small random change can trigger a phase transition analogous to the transformation of very cold liquid beer into solid beer when the cap of the bottle is popped, suddenly reducing the pressure in the bottle. A proud physicist is naturally tempted to announce these insights through the bullhorn of metaphysics. But philosophers interested in the logic of questions will draw attention to the role of emphasis in framing requests for explanations. Philosophers read why is there something rather than nothing, tenselessly, as in why is pi an irrational number. The philosophers also read something as a quantifier ranging over any concrete entity. The quantum vacuum is a concrete entity in the sense described in sections 4 and 7, and so is in the philosopher's domain of discourse. But for rhetorical effect, physicists anachronistically backdate their domain of discourse to the things of 19th century physics. Thus, the physicists wind up addressing why is there something rather than nothing. Philosophers complain of misleading advertising. They asked one question and the proud physicists answered a different question. Lawrence Krauss defends the switch as an improvement. Often scientists make progress by altering the meaning of key terms. Why stick with an intractable and arguably meaningless question? Our questions, like our children, can mature without losing their identity over time. Thinkers in the tradition of phenomenology retain Schopenhauer's conviction that the emotion harbors a metaphysical insight. Instead of tossing the question into the emotivist wastebasket like the logical positivists or lapsing into quietism like Wittgenstein, existentialists provide detailed treatments of the awe expressed by the ultimate question. They built on Schopenhauer's literary approach to philosophy, depicting the emotion in plays and novels such as Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea. Like the arch-pessimist Schopenhauer, Sartre's protagonist experiences our crowded world as de trop, overstuffed with accidental beings. Sartre himself, after an unpleasant experiment with mescaline, was chronically creeped out by the countryside vegetation edging its way into Paris. In The Concept of Dread, Søren Kierkegaard, 1844, claims that nothingness wells up into our awareness through moods and emotions. Emotions are intentional states. They are directed towards something. If angered, I'm angry at something. If amused, there is something I find amusing. Free-floating anxiety is often cited as a counterexample. But Kierkegaard says that in this case, the emotion is directed at nothingness. According to Heidegger, we have several motives to shy away from the significance of our emotional encounters with nothingness. They are premonitions of the nothingness of death. They echo the groundlessness of human existence. Some have hoped that our recognition of our rootlessness would rescue meaning from the chaos of nothing, but Heidegger denies us such solace. Heidegger does think freedom is rooted in nothingness. He also says we derive our concept of logical negation from this experience of nothing. This suggests a privileged perspective for human beings. We differ from animals with respect to nothing. Since Heidegger thinks that animals do not experience nothingness, he is committed to skepticism about animal reasoning involving negation. Consider the Stoic example of a dog that is following a trail. The dog reaches a fork in the road, sniffs at one road, and then, without a further sniff, proceeds down the only remaining road. The Stoics took this as evidence that the dog has performed a disjunctive syllogism. Either my quarry went down this road or that road. Sniff, he did not go down this road, therefore he went down that road. Heidegger must discount this as anthropomorphism. Many biologists and psychologists side with the Stoics' emphasis on our continuity with animals. They deny that human beings have a monopoly on nothingness. A classic anomaly for the stimulus-response behaviorist was the laboratory rat that responds to the absence of a stimulus. One rather puzzling class of situations which elicit fear are those which consist of a lack of stimulation. Some members of this class may be special instances of novelty. An anesthetized chimpanzee could be described as a normal chimpanzee with the added novelty of no movement. Solitude could be the novelty of no companions. This is not simply quibbling with words, for there is very good evidence, see chapter 13, that the failure of a stimulus to occur at a point in time or space where it usually occurs acts like any other kind of novel stimulus. However, the intensity of the fear evoked by the sight of a dead or mutilated body is so much greater than that evoked by more ordinary forms of novelty that we perhaps ought to seek an alternative explanation of the effects of this stimulus. Fear of the dark is also difficult to account for in terms of novelty, since by the time this fear matures, darkness is no less familiar than the light. Gray, 1987, 22. These anomalies for behaviorism fill rationalists with mixed emotions. On the one hand, the experiments refute the empiricist principle that everything known about the world is learned from experience. On the other hand, the experiments also constitute a caution against over-intellectualizing absences. A correct explanation of emotional engagement with absences must be more general and cognitively less demanding than rationalists tend to presuppose. Even mosquito larvae see shadows. Doubts about whether they have consciousness do not make us doubt that they see shadows. So the perception of absences cannot depend on consciousness or any other advanced mental state. Perhaps the earliest form of vision was of these absences of light. So instead of being a pinnacle of intellectual sophistication, cognition of absences may be primal. Existentialists endorse the high standards assumed by rationalists. Their disagreement with the rationalists is over whether the standards are met. The existentialists are disappointed by the contrast between our expectations of how reality ought to behave and how it in fact performs. This sense of absurdity makes existentialists more accepting of paradoxes than rationalists. Whereas rationalists nervously view paradoxes as a challenge to the authority of reason, existentialists welcome them as opportunities to correct unrealistic hopes. Existentialists are fond of ironies and do not withdraw reflexively from the pain of contradiction. They stoically introspect upon the inconsistency in the hope of achieving a resolution that does justice to the three-dimensionality of deep philosophical problems. For instance, Heidegger is sensitive to the hazards of saying that nothing exists. Like an electrician who must twist and bend a wire to make it travel through an intricate hole, the metaphysician must twist and bend a sentence to probe deeply into the nature of being. Rudolf Carnap thinks Heidegger's contorted sentences malfunction. To illustrate, Carnap quotes snippets from Heidegger's What is Metaphysics? What is to be investigated is being only and nothing else, being alone and further nothing, solely being and beyond being nothing. What about this nothing? Does the nothing exist only because the not, that is the negation, exists? Or is it the other way around? Does negation and the not exist only because the nothing exists? We assert the nothing is prior to the not and the negation. Where do we seek the nothing? How do we find the nothing? We know the nothing. Anxiety reveals the nothing. That for which and because of which we were anxious was really nothing. Indeed, the nothing itself, as such, was present. What about this nothing? The nothing itself nothings. What does a man love more than life? Hate more than death or mortal strife? That which contented men desire, the poor have, the rich require, the miser spends, the spendthrift saves, and all men carry to their graves. So, at last, what is nothing?